problem. It's just in
Oh,
stream. I think we are live.
I think no, I think you're right. I think we are live.
Yeah, okay.
Um,
So, like always, but I think we have an excuse this time because both of us are not in our usual familiar settings. So Fran is on holiday, or he's at least trying to take some time off, and so am I. So, welcome everyone to season 3, episode 5 of the FPL Script. Hard reset. I'm JD, also known as @Schadenfreudist on Twitter, with my co-host Fran here, FPL_Fran. I think most of you already know him. This is our Game Week 1 preview, and we're just going to go through both of our drafts. Also, going to talk about the usual xMins segment and also captaincy because now we are finally at a stage where we can talk about captaincy for Game Week 1. So, welcome everyone, and let's just start with Fran's team. Fran, do you want to take us through your team?
yeah, sure. So it's Henderson as the goalkeeper with Fabianski, but that could be Matthews in time to come. Then I've got in the defense Trent Alexander-Arnold, Pedro Porro, Jarrell Quansah, and as my sort of backup defenders, I've got Barco and Ezri Konsa. And then in my actual team, I've got Nkunku, Saka, Bruno Fernandes in the midfield with Eze, although we'll talk Eze in a moment. And for the time being, I've got Morgan Rogers also because there's news that we'll talk about in a moment. But in the front line, rounding things out, I've got João Pedro, Isak, and Haaland. And I am currently prepared to captain Isak as things stand for Game Week 1.
So, also we need to discuss about how drafts are made for Game Week 1. So, is this an agnostic game wildcard agnostic draft? Have you looked at wildcard windows?
Yeah, correct. I've looked at wildcard windows, I think, from the start. And I've ran a lot of chip strategy solves using my own xMin. So I think there's no real reason to run solves on the default xMins. I've run multiple solves on different xMins on chip strategy, and wildcard 6 comes out as pretty clear. So then what I did after that is sort of look at, is there a good case for the wildcard 6 in terms of swerving it from a narrative perspective, or, for, let's say, things that could vastly change my mind on it. And I guess the other window would be wildcard 4. But it didn't really throw out too much EV for me, nor was I that interested. I also think that all of us content creators or even just engaged managers will probably do a slightly early wildcard. Nothing too crazy. But I think, when you look at previous seasons, we'll probably have people wildcarding between 4 and 8, I imagine. And then I think wildcard 12 has also come up as a pretty popular one. But given that the EV was there for 6, and obviously we're only looking at a limited horizon, so that was 12. But I also had a look at some of the fixture horizons really up until Game Week 20. I think Elevenify was kind enough to share to me some of the fixture data that he had in
Hmm.
terms of goal projections,
Hmm.
and I had a look at even some of the sort of future horizons right beyond 12. But as someone who generally likes to wild card or doesn't really mind it, doesn't plan to use too many transfers before the first wild card, but still will. I just liked the sound of 6 because it's also after the transfer window and also after the first international break. So, if I need to really pull the trigger on wildcard 4, I'll do it. But for now, very clearly on a wildcard 6.
Okay, perfect. And I suppose I'll save some of the discussion regarding this draft for my draft because it's essentially the same draft. It's crazy, and honest to God, we haven't discussed anything regarding FPL drafts. So it's mostly been about non-FPL games. So this just shows that if you are subscribing to a certain strategy, then I think the only deviations would be regarding certain personnel and not regarding maybe the spots themselves. Like for example, 9.5 million midfielders, 10.5, 10 million midfielders. So anyway, let's go to my draft. I'm just going to read it out for podcast listeners. Anderson in goal, Porro, Alexander Arnold, and Dunk in defense. Bruno Fernandes, Morgan Rogers, Eze, Saka in midfield. Saka is my captain as it stands. Isaac vice captain, João Pedro and Holland, and on my bench I have Fabianski, Nkunku, Konza, and Wout. And again, Wout represents a 4 million defender. It can be anyone, and I'll certainly not go with Watford, given Elevenify's team strength data and Leicester being really close to the rock bottom. So I don't want to unnecessarily jeopardize my team from Gameweek 1. So the key differences are obviously Kwanzaa is not in my team, and instead I have Dunk.
Yeah,
Huge differences. I'm starting Rogers
nice.
instead of Nkunku, and we have a different $4 million defender, a £4 million defender. So I have Faiz instead of his Barco. Um, Honestly, I've looked at wildcard windows, and also Review has launched his new MILP, mixed integer linear programming solver. Uh, It
Mm.
hasn't changed anything, if I'm being honest. I've tried a
Right.
lot of different strategies. We were not using wildcard, and the only things that let me just ask you a couple of questions based on this. So I know that both of our drafts have certain xMins risk, right? So you spoke about you don't mind wildcarding early, and Kwanzaa seems to be one of those players who right now definitely seems to be starting the first couple of games, but after
Yeah.
that the visibility on his guaranteed minutes sort of lowers. So how do you plan on dealing with that if that
I
happens?
think
That is,
no, of course.
yeah.
I think with Kwanzaa, right? You look at him and you think game weeks 1 and 2 are good. So him starting there is already a great position in the draft. And then um, game 3 isn't a particularly good game week, so ideally he'd be benched anyways. So
Hmm,
I don't see that as a particular issue because
hmm.
that's what Kwanzaa does. Kwanzaa from Aston Villa, that's what he does in my
Yeah.
draft in game week 3. And then in terms of game week 4. That's where you want Kwanzaa really to be playing again. But then I still have at the day Kwanzaa, and I've got Barco, right? So Barco having a good 4 and 5 is
Hmm,
nice on paper, but we will talk about Barco's xMins later. But Konsa himself having a good 3, 4, 5 in general, I think goes nicely with the idea that if, let's say, Jared Konsa from Liverpool loses his minutes to Konate,
hmm,
that I wouldn't be in too bad of a spot. I do recognize that there's a spot where, let's say, Kwanzaa and Barco are in sort of dubious X-Men's territory in game weeks 4 and 5, and my draft would be a little bit of an issue. Um, but I think when you think about the potential upside of having someone like Kwanzaa in your team, particularly since this draft structure itself does lose a little bit of EV, right? It's not like this is a premium defense altogether. It's not Gabriel Guardiol plus Trent or those two or three players plus Porro. So you simply have to think about whether the upside is there for Kwanzaa, and I really think it is because ultimately Liverpool have a great run of games. You can't really ask for better or a better run of expected clean sheets really for Liverpool. And so since I don't see myself jumping into triple Liverpool outside of going for Salah,
hmm.
as in I'm not missing out on, let's say, going for Jota. I'm not missing out on maybe going for Robertson, I suppose, which I still think is a bit of a gamble. I'm quite happy to go with a structure like this to start.
That makes a lot of sense. Another thing that I was thinking about is Pedro Porro. Obviously, we all know about Tottenham's defensive frailties, but the fact that both of us have him in our team is a testament to how good his expected value is, right? And again, we keep coming back to this thing where in isolation, the defensive numbers obviously are not the greatest. And so you might want to maybe squeeze out 0.5 million somewhere else and try to get to Guardiola, which seems to be the most obvious upgrade. But then again, I think you should let some EV sometimes dictate your moves. Of course, you shouldn't just blindly follow it. But I just feel like in this case where Pedro Porro's EV is substantially better than most defenders, I don't see why we wouldn't. So I'm guessing that's why you also have him, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
100%.
Absolutely. So for Trent, I've seen a couple of chats where people were talking about maybe downgrading him to someone like Virgil and then using those funds to distribute them. Now the problem that I've seen with that, yeah, Virgil. So the problem I've seen with that is I've tried to distribute those funds and I wasn't as successful. As in, I don't see a meaningful upgrade. Maybe one of the upgrades that I was trying to get was Rogers to someone like Gibbs White. or any 6.5 million midfielder, I guess. But do you see that as something that is more sustainable? Because in this case, I would definitely say that benching Rogers is a much better option, right? And you can just keep benching him if he loses his spot, and you would not miss out on a lot of money in your main 11.
Yeah, I think with Virgil, I have to say his EV isn't great, right? Um, I think even last season, the only time we ever really wanted Virgil in our teams was when there was a double. And that sort of points out to how he might be a little overpriced, I think. Because, yes, of course, we think he's a gigantic aerial threat. But then if you compare to someone like Gabriel, right, who's a huge
Hmm.
aerial threat, and
Hmm.
probably even before the Calafiori signing, and this is how the context works, because the game had assigned Virgil's price before and Gabriel's price, crucially, before, let's say, the Calafiori signing. So
Hmm.
I don't think we really thought that Gabriel's minutes were under threat when, let's say, the prices were made. So from that as context, and Gabriel playing for an infinitely better defense, I just think that Virgil is a little bit overpriced. So if it makes any sense, you'd probably want to have Robertson at any time at the same price point. So Robertson's price drop was actually very noticeable. And I think the EV is there because what you tend to see is when you look at solves with, let's say, starting someone like Gabriel or Guardiola instead, you get sometimes a recommendation to either go. Let's if you went Gabriel without Guardiola, you'd get an idea, which is something like Gabriel to Guardiola on game week
Hmm.
2, or the alternative is on game week 4. If you own Guardiola and Gabriel to start the season, you probably actually are recommended to go Gabriel to Robertson. But I've never seen Virgil thrown up. So I feel like Virgil's one of those picks where people go for it because they might be scared, I suppose, of missing out on a Liverpool asset, but then you're kind of missing the point on potentially just getting the EV out of your budget, right?
Yeah.
So I don't love Virgil. I haven't seen him on any drafts, to be fair.
So I guess the discussion was, if you think Kwanzaa is not good enough in terms of his minutes guarantee, and then
Mm.
you still want to downgrade Trent, then. But I agree with you. It seems like you're half committing to a strategy where you either want to downgrade Trent to Kwanzaa and then really want to spend it somewhere else. Otherwise, you add Kwanzaa to Trent and you play both of them like you have. So I think we can
Yeah,
move
I
on
get that.
to, yeah, sorry. So we can move on to the next segment, which crucially this week we have a lot of things to talk about, and I'm going to let Fran kick us off with the biggest news of today, which is Oscar Bobb's injury.
Yeah, 100%. So Oscar Bobb reported by two major city outlets. I think Blue Tone, who a little bit dubious, I'd say, because I
Hmm.
think he's had arguments with Tony. I think we probably prefer Tony's veracity. As far as FPL main road, though, he's been someone who's been very consistent in the past, and he's also mentioned that Bob was seen in crutches, and he's also mentioned that he's taken Bob out of his own draft. So it's very clear that Bob is. I mean, there's an injury. I think Benji in chat has also alluded to a couple things too. Um, so it's worth looking at, whether we have a source. But I think it's very clear that Bob might be injured, and fortunately, my draft doesn't have Bob in it right now, so I didn't have any issues to deal with. And obviously, Rogers is there for a lot of us wildcard 6 players as a great option to think about.
Yeah, as I see in the chat that someone says Jack Gohan is a City journal, and he said that it's a fracture and going to Barcelona.
Hmm.
So if that is the case, which I haven't read myself, and maybe we'll do that once we end the stream. Yeah, then he's no longer an option. And I guess you tweeted this morning, right, that you were the dilemma you had was whether to go for Bob or not. So I guess that dilemma has resolved
Yeah,
itself. And
yeah.
I'm guessing that people who were going to go for Oscar Bob were primarily going with wildcard 4 as their strategy, because
Hmm.
I don't think, I mean, his minutes till week 4 weren't even secured. But I guess if you look at a decay of minutes, at least till game week 4, you could justify keeping him and then selling him and changing strategy to maybe Salah, getting Salah instead of Holland or something like that. So that makes sense. Do we have? I think that's all about Oscar Pop, right? We can move on to the next one, which is Jota. So Jota has clearly started, or many of the friendlies, as the striker. And the question, I suppose, is how do you see Darwin cutting into Jota's minutes, or how do you see Gakpo cutting into his minutes, and the left wing and the centre forward spots working out within Liverpool?
Yeah, I think you have to imagine, unless let's say Luis Diaz leaves, you're still dealing with the conundrum, which is four players, two
Hmm.
spots,
Yeah.
for the most part, and that's just not good enough, right? You're basically dealing with Jota, who can start, let's say, the first two, three fixtures, but I still think it's hard to believe that Darwin won't get some starts
Hmm.
between, let's say, one and five. Or that he won't be an extremely early substitution for Jota, at least within a few games. So, yeah, I mean, Darwin played 60 minutes in the preseason. That's all, and the same applies for Gakpo. So you can say for the first fixture of the season that they could be really good Jota minutes. But even running, let's say, Jota's minutes with a slightly amped up number, which is something like 75 with natural decay, potentially what you can do, of course, is do something where the minutes are a little bit higher, specifically just on game week one, and then you have a natural decay on something that you think is acceptable, like let's say 65. But I still think that either way, it's very, very poor for Jota, the EV, and I think maybe a little bit, of course, is capturing that Jota is playing multiple positions, whereas now he's clearly a centre forward under slot. But I still don't really like the gambles you have to take, because you also have to think that if Jota's minutes do go bad, or if there's a time where suddenly you think Darwin is going to be first choice, and that happens over the first few weeks, then you just also know that you're booking a transfer,
Hmm.
which you that there's a hidden cost of that, which you just need to factor in as whatever your free transfer value is too. Plus, any knock-on impacts of info value and things like that. So I don't love Jota as a pick, to be honest, but that's because I think I am planning for probably more than just the short term, which I would argue is something like wildcard four.
That is a great point because the biggest rule change we've had is obviously being able to roll up to 5 free transfers, and that just means that your plans have to be much more robust because ultimately it's going to be you versus the field, right? So if everyone in the field continues to spend transfers every single week, then it's fine. But that's not what's going to happen, and so inevitably you will be left behind if you start planning short-term moves like, okay, I'm going to sell Jota after game week 3, 4, whatever it is. And like you said, if we see that Darwin is getting closer to a start, that just means that Jota is likely to be on the bench. And also, so just a number in the review, if you were to put in, would put in maybe less than 70 minutes average for him. Yeah. So definitely one to avoid for me. The next one is Eze. Now Eze is not from a direct minutes perspective because he is the main man at Crystal Palace. He takes penalties, set pieces, and he's just a phenomenal player. So there's no issue there. The issue is, first of all, City's links with Eze, and the second one is now Oscar Bobb's injury, because the plan was to rotate between Savio and Oscar Bobb on the right wing, and I'm assuming that Bernardo would maybe fill in sometime. I know that the talks were that he was supposed to now move in along with Foden, but ultimately, if they don't have enough players, Bernardo still could play right wing, right? So, given these factors and maybe City steps up their bid or maybe accelerates the process, because both of us own him as well. Are you more concerned today after the Bob news?
What I would need to see to be concerned is some bigger Man City sources,
Hmm.
like Sam Lee, for example, indicating that Man City are like fairly in the market for Eze. Otherwise, it's a bit of fear mongering. I get the point though, because of course, if you start the season with Eze, and let's say he gets transferred before the window closes, and we get more news after the game week one deadline, then you're at a bit of an impasse, right? Because you
Hmm.
might have just lost a little bit of value when you're dropped. But I think you still have to point out to the idea that from an FPL perspective, he is just an absurdly ridiculous pick. When you look at, for
Yeah.
example, like even someone like Elevenify, I think he was just running off his own numbers, and in an article today just mentioned that Eze is the by far the best value option in the game, I think, alongside Nkunku. So it's one of those picks where I feel like starting the season without him, unless there's substantial information to lead you against Eze, which is transfer speculation sort of related. If your issues with Eze are things like, I don't know, lack of Elise, things like that, then I think
Hmm.
you should probably let those
Yeah.
thoughts step aside, because he's just that impact to pick, and that's simply because he does everything that you want from a fantasy perspective.
So one more question that inevitably people will ask is, let's say you want to go for another Palace attacker because Maybe
Hmm.
Glasner's limited period in the Premier League has proven to some people that he is great at setting up attacking sides. So, would
Right.
you downgrade Eze to someone like Kamada, for example? We've spoken about Kamada previously on the podcast as well. So, would you go for
Yeah.
someone like him or Ismail Assar instead of Eze, or would you just say that those players have even more uncertainty because, first of all, they're not Sar. Sar has already played in the Premier League, but for a new team and still not familiar with the dynamic of the team. And for Kamada, his previous stint in Serie A was uninspiring. And so we still don't know. We hope that he gets back to his base level. But assuming that there's been a drop off and it will take some time for him to get back up to speed, that surely means that there's more uncertainty with those players, right?
Yeah, I don't think I touched any of those players until Eze actually left the club,
Hmm.
because right now I think what you'll probably see is Mateta as a Kamada, and then Sar as a sub for Kamada, and
Hmm.
then Ayu as a substitute for Eze.
Yeah.
And the issue with Kamada, I think, is when you go back to his minutes, even when he was enjoying a great run of a couple seasons of football, his minutes were still very much reduced. So,
Hmm.
and also they spent a fair bit on Sar. So I just think that he's going to be a pretty quick auto sub. So I don't think I would really be into Kamada until, yeah, if you see Eze leave, and suddenly I think, okay, maybe he's a little bit higher in the priority and can maybe play multiple roles, and is still good value for that reason.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but Palace played 5-2-2-1, right, in their last friendly.
I think something like that, yeah.
Yeah, because you mentioned Eze and Kamada playing further
Yeah,
forward behind
Kamada
Mateta.
was the direct,
Yeah,
yeah. So that was the starting three.
yeah,
Obviously, it wasn't
yeah,
Mateta at the time, but Mateta's back now, which is why I'm
yeah.
implying that he starts. But Kamada was a direct substitution for Sar, or
Okay,
rather, vice versa. Sar
vice
was a
versa. Yeah,
substitute
yeah.
for Kamada.
That makes sense. I think we can move on to the next one. And there are two players from Brighton that we've picked to talk about because our teams sort of revolve around those players. More for Fran than myself, but Joao Pedro to start with. 5.5 million forward that everyone was excited to own because he's on penalties and plays for a good team and also has good underlying numbers. But the lack of minutes in the preseason friendlies has definitely it's definitely off-putting in a sense. So where do you stand on his minutes? So do you think he starts game week one? If he does, what is your gauge on his xMins for the first couple of game weeks?
Yeah, I think going back to the point where I said sometimes you have to just adjust the game week one, but then you have a
Hmm.
natural decay.
Hmm.
So what I would do is probably adjust his X-Men's to like 75, but then actually then
Go
reduce the game
upward.
week one actual
Yeah.
minutes downwards to like 65, because I'm
Hmm.
assuming that he's going to be a pre-planned substitution in that game.
Hmm.
That could even arguably be on the low side, because ultimately, his threat now is a little bit of Grudemans and then mostly Sarmiento. But from just listening to what the coach says and also just generally what we know about João Pedro, I can't see his minutes really being bad unless he's injured. The only thing I don't really know is how early substitutions are used. But I think you always have to contextualize. Sometimes there are players who we've seen that can press, in the 80th, 90th minute of the game, and we've seen João Pedro do that, particularly in that second half of the season with Roberto De Zerbi, right? So I really can't see João Pedro's minutes really being too bad enough to, like, some people are probably going to reduce his minutes enough so that he doesn't exist and solve. So it kind of goes back to
Hmm.
our discussion last week, and I feel like you probably have to look at him the opposite lens, where you kind of make that judgment call about João Pedro as well, in spite of how aggressively you might be, or how cautiously you might be approaching his X-Men, because he is a very, very good player and projected to be probably the best 5.5 by far as an attacker.
I suppose the only reason you would go for someone like Stuart Armstrong over him, considering they are of the same price, is because you
Adam,
have,
all right.
yeah, sorry, Adam Armstrong, my bad. Adam
Sorry.
Armstrong, is that there's enough of a doubt in your mind regarding the likelihood of him starting in game week one. Because if he is starting, like you said, the like the split between him getting subbed early and him getting subbed after 70 minutes is, let's say, 60-40. And if you were to do that's what I'm thinking. And so if you were to do the math and come up with a number, like you said, maybe I would start off with something like 68 and then take it up to, let's say, 77 or 80, and then maybe a slow decay after that point, because Technically, Gruda hasn't been signed yet, I guess, but we are assuming he will be. So that still leaves us with a little bit of unknown, I guess, spots in the team. So the second player from the same team is Barco, and you own Barco. He's on your bench. So I just want to understand the thought process. If they sign Kadioglu, what do you think that will mean? Would you immediately swap him for another 4 million defender?
Nah, I don't think I would, because I don't really plan on playing any of the other 4 million defenders anyways, and I have like I still stand by the fact that I think that Barco is someone who clearly was signed to, be a key player for the club. So there's a right back position for Kadiolu to play in. He can even technically play center mid from what we've seen in the past. I just think that unless, let's say, Barco is really struggling with fitness or something like that, given the pacing of the season, I think Barco's minutes should be really good at the left back position up until Estupiñán is back, and those are my thoughts. But yeah, I just can't imagine why you'd sign Barco, who's clearly a brilliant player and has been pretty active in the preseason anyways, and then suddenly have him play a little bit less so that you can continue to I guess play Veltman, for example, on the side, or so yeah, I'm not getting too upset about the fact that they're pretty much going to sign Kadioglu. So Barco will probably be in my draft.
Where would you estimate his minutes at in terms of, let's say,
Yeah,
the
that's a good point.
first 4 weeks? If you were to
Yeah,
put it into review. Yeah.
yeah. I guess the issue once again is going to be like how you are planning around the Esteban injury, right? Because there must be, like, what I've done is I've run multiple types of solves. Like some solves where I think his minutes aren't greater than 4 and 5. What happens there? Some solves where he's just someone who's like 75 minutes from the start with decay. And obviously we don't need to talk about anywhere upwards of that, right? So I think those are your sort of two cases. And the reality is in both sorts of types of solves, you see Barco anyways, and that gives me enough confidence to go for him as a pick. When you look at, let's say, a lot of the review solves too, I think the reality is it doesn't really plan for you to play a lot of 4.0s, which is also why you tend to see some solves which are even more ridiculous, which are, the double 4.0
Yeah.
solves, which I don't think any of us really intuitively can get behind, those of us who are analytically inclined. But it still just shows you the value, I suppose, of Barco, even with really reduced minutes, even in the good fixtures in Gameweeks 4 and 5. So yeah, I'm pretty much going to stick to Barco.
Yeah, fair enough. I misspoke a little bit when I said two. There is actually three players from Brighton that we handpicked. The third one is Jakub Minte. And we already spoke about Gruda and the imminent signing of him. So Jakub Minte is someone who has extraordinary numbers from Eredivisie and has played for, I think it was like 2090s in his previous season. So not an insignificant number of games, but I suppose it's not huge compared to the sample sizes we have for some other players. So I guess the question is, how much do you trust his underlines? And review takes care of some of those things. But if the intuition is that he will continue to register those underlines, does it make sense to get him in and essentially anticipate the rise in EV that will inevitably come?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Because I think I would really like to know what Madueke's sort of numbers were like in PSV, because I feel like I wonder if he would be a good comparison, because I
What
think
about
I'm
Kudus?
looking at,
Because Kudus has absolutely
yeah,
struggled, right?
yeah,
XG XA numbers, not in his dribbling numbers.
right. Yeah, because when I actually look at someone like Madueke or Kudus, they just had absolutely bonkers numbers, right?
Mm.
And it hasn't translated that immediately. But I have, yeah, we said already in the previous podcast that Brighton is a much better team than West Ham under Moyes, so that's a huge plus for Minte. And so I think, yeah, I mean, he's probably going to be a pick that a lot of us go into, but then I also have to say that you have players like Nkunku who basically represent the same problem. And so I guess my issue when I look at my own draft is, I don't think Eze's bad. I don't think Bruno's bad. I don't think I'm going to go off of Saka. I don't think I'm going to go off of Nkunku. And then suddenly, do I even really have space for Minte, despite potentially being game breaking? Probably not is the answer, because unless you, let's say, really think that someone like João Pedro is worse than Minte, which I don't think so. then that's where the issue comes from. And that's before you even talk about, I guess, Gruda and where I suppose the minutes are a little bit capped from that perspective too.
So the players you mentioned sort of cover both sides of the spectrum, I think, from an Eredivisie perspective, where you have someone like Madueke who's never really gotten enough minutes consistently at
Yeah,
Chelsea to showcase if he can deliver those numbers,
yeah,
but they are also not insignificant. And on the other side, you have someone like Kudus who has played, I think it was like 35 90s or something across the season, across all competitions. And so that has been more than enough of a sample size to show that maybe it is also up to the manager, like you said. With under new management, you could potentially see a better Kudus, and we hope that is the case. But right now, there are enough doubts in our minds that I would also swerve someone like Minte and go for maybe some of the other sub 6 million midfielders, like you said, who are better placed in terms of minutes and their proven ability in the Premier League. So the next one is back to Liverpool defense, but primarily Robertson, and this ties to Robertson's recent injury struggles, and also because he's getting on in terms of age as well. So do you think we've already spoken briefly about this, where you said that Robertson could potentially be a better choice than someone like Virgil, just because of his attacking output? So any thoughts on getting Robertson in your team
yeah. I mean, I think
in
just
terms of minutes?
remembering.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a good point
Yeah.
actually. I need to remind myself with the minutes, or rather the fixture layout, because I believe Liverpool play a little bit later. Yeah, I mean Liverpool are. When did they play? Did they play on the? Yeah, well, actually, to be fair, they do play as a first game on Saturday. So
Hmm.
then I wonder, with the timeliness of some of our previous Liverpool leagues, we'll actually know Robertson will start. But I think if we know Robertson starts in game week 1, then I would actually generally consider Robertson back into my draft because, yeah, the EV is just ridiculous. As we
Hmm.
mentioned, for a 6.0 with those fixtures, then yeah, I'd have to reconsider him because um, if he's fit to start game week 1, then I just think that he'd be fit to start until effectively all the fixtures until the Champions League. Um, so I'd probably have a big U-turn on my answer on Robertson. But for now, because we've seen that Tsimikas played in that Sevilla game, which was very clearly the A-teamers,
Hmm.
in my perspective, and Robertson didn't, I have to imagine that Tsimikas starts game week 1, or at least there's a gigantic doubt in my mind as to whether Robertson starts. And so it's not really worth missing out. Because if you, let's say, docked Robertson's minutes to, let's say, 45, for
Hmm.
example, on game week 1, I imagine you wouldn't have a solve coming out with Robertson, but you very much could have a solve that is something of the look of what we mentioned earlier, which is something like Gabriel to Robertson a little bit later down the line, potentially even Gabriel to Robertson game week 2. But
Hmm.
yeah, because I'm not fully confident that he'll start game week 1. It's just not someone. He's not someone that I'm looking for to do poorly. I suppose my question back to you is: do you think if once he gets starting before Champions League, do you think he's just going to suddenly continue starting, or do you think it can be a bit dicey? Because I guess the issue with Robertson too is that he has a very good available backup, and he's old enough, I suppose, as a player where I'd think maybe there's going to be games where he only plays 65, 70 minutes, which is also something you probably need to factor in terms of EV.
Correct. So the second thing you said is my bigger concern, that even if Robertson does start most of the games from game week 2 onwards, assuming that Simika starts game week 1 until the Champions League starts, I still don't think there are enough minutes there. And the problem is that once Liverpool, or if Liverpool lose the clean sheet, then you're solely depending on him playing as many minutes as possible in order to get some sort of attacking return. And let's say Trent and Robertson are extreme outliers in terms of defense, where you can actually try to bank on their attacking returns, as
Yeah.
opposed to once the clean sheet is gone, you should just stop hoping for any sort of returns. So Robertson losing minutes past the 60th or 70th minute murks him, I think, further than most defenders. Because for most defenders, I would argue that it also boosts their chance of a clean sheet, where they get subbed and then they concede, the team concedes. But with someone like Robertson, I would say that it's solely a negative for his expected value. So an avoid for me. But as you said, if we get a leak, then it is very tempting, because that fixture is so good that it might actually give you enough points and expected value for you to even spend a free transfer later down the line. So let's see if we can get enough of a league that we are confident in, but I suppose we'll leave it up to that. The next
Yeah,
point
I really
is,
did like
yeah,
the point
sorry.
that you made though. Sorry,
Yeah,
just on how Liverpool is attack tilted. So
yes.
someone like Zinchenko, oddly, like if you told me he was going to play 65 minutes per game, which doesn't happen, right? Sometimes if you're on the edge of that, you could always
Yeah,
be a 59-minute sub.
yep,
But
yep.
he played for such a strong team, and I think he would always hit his sort of like his like baselines for the pass metrics like very early into the game anyway. So it's like you'd love it if Zinchenko was subbed off 65 every game, but
Absolutely.
for someone like Robertson, it's definitely not great. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. So the next point is Arsenal defense, and this is where Fran and I have a little disagreement. Not too big. It's just a little disagreement.
Super
So
controversial.
yeah, I saw someone in the chat also asking the question whether to go for Saliba or Gabriel. So I just left answering the question until we got to this part of the podcast. So essentially, we have. I'm trying to list all the defenders that I can think of, but essentially we have Kivior, White, Calafiori, Gabriel, Saliba, Zinchenko and Timber. So 7 players competing for 4 spots. And now I know it's not all for all spots, but most of them are quite interchangeable. So I think that Gabriel does has a lot of uncertainty in his xMins. Now I appreciate that I've read up on a couple of journalists talking about how Calafiori's integration is going to be a slow process, which makes sense because he's new to the league, he's pretty young, all of that. I just feel like there's too many players in the mix, so I'm naturally thinking his minutes will be reduced, but I know Fran disagrees. So I'll let Fran maybe convince me that Gabriel actually has great X-Mins.
I think part of the things that I look into are things in the preseason, like who's actually subbing off Gabriel.
Hmm.
Are you seeing someone play a lot of left center backs alongside someone like Saliba, or if there's even a pairing that's being tried? And I have to say, like I'm seeing things like Glad Kelly as a substitution for Gabriel, and I'm
Hmm.
not really worried about it. We see the traditional Zinchenko substitution, so it's very clear. We're looking at an Arteta who's looking at once again Kira at left back, potentially Calafiori as well.
Hmm.
And whilst I don't disagree that just all these players can clearly take away some minutes from Gabriel, I just don't think it's going to happen that fast. And also just the importance these games have. We have to go back to, technically, yes, there's a player who can play right wing minutes in this Arsenal team. It's Reiss Nelson, right? But have we really seen Reiss Nelson have to play football unless he's absolutely needed to? And Saka's injured? Probably not. And I kind of feel like that maybe applies to something like Kiwior. We already talked about how Calafiori is going to be integrating a little bit more slowly, but clearly was a big buy for them. Yeah, I just think to start the season, when you are only playing one game a week, I don't think Arteta is going to risk anything, and I don't think there's a reason to either, because Gabriel is also a huge threat, if we're being honest. Like
Hmm.
from the set pieces, I imagine that's a big thing for Arsenal as well. The fact that he is either what Anthony Martin calls a decoy, but when we're being realistic, is very clearly the main threat of the team. Via set pieces. I think Gabriel's minutes should be safe, and I'd always probably go for Gabriel too. And just to touch on Saliba, yes, of course, his minutes are more guaranteed. But then we do know that there's a pretty big substantial drop off, right, in terms of like the shots per game from Gabriel versus Saliba,
Hmm.
and just the XGI last
AGI.
2 seasons already. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So another maybe point to uh, help support the argument that Saliba's X-Mins might not also be as great as in compared to last season is because we've already read that Calafiori was brought in primarily so that Saliba will not be as fatigued this season.
Yeah.
Because clearly he was overplayed last season between Champions League and every other competition and Premier League. So it clearly is a ploy to rotate the centre backs more. But I think you made a great point where I was thinking about replacements, right? And Reece Nelson is so far below Saka as a replacement that it's pretty unlikely. But on paper, if you were to look at it just from a replacement perspective, then you should be talking minutes of Saka, which no one does. So I suppose
Yeah.
it's a similar argument for Gabriel because maybe I'm underrating Gabriel in terms of the player he is because as a defender, I mean, of course, he's an
Mm.
exceptional header of the ball and attacker in the opposition box. But maybe I'm underrating him as a defender, because once the whole Saudi thing went away in the start of the season, we didn't really see him being under threat at any point in the season. So maybe you're right, and also what makes me think that I'm underestimating Gabriel a little bit in terms of his xMins is the number of players who I think are good FPL managers going for him. Because their strategy is
Mm,
different from ours, we really are not considering Arsenal defenders right now to start the season.
yeah.
But for people who are considering, let's say, bench boost game week 1 or earlier wildcard and locking themselves into a certain strategy, definitely are starting the season with someone like Gabriel. So, yeah, like I said, I didn't have a very strong opinion about this, but maybe I am convinced that his X-Men should be better than what I think they should be. So the next one is Newcastle Defence, and we have two players that we thought we should touch upon. The first one is Lewis Hall, and the other one is Dan Burn. Danban primarily because it looks like the Mark Gahey deal is not happening to Newcastle. I mean, we said that about Pascal Gross, and then all of a sudden he was in Dortmund. So it's not completely ruled out, but I suppose it's cooling off. And if that is the case, then the left centre back spot also opens up for someone like Dan Burn. So my question to you is maybe twofold. First of all, how do you envisage Dan Burn's minutes? And then the second question is, if we think that Dan Burn is going to play multiple positions, then does that also affect Louis Hall's minutes at left back?
Yeah, I think one of the issues is Lloyd Kelly, right, who can actually do
Yes.
both as well.
Yep.
Um, I still think that just reading the comments that Howe has mentioned about Lloyd Kelly,
Mm,
that probably will be looked at as a little bit of a backup option at the start of the season,
mm,
and then his minutes could well rise. But then I think from that perspective, you'd probably think that Byrne and Hall can actually have somewhat perfect minutes to start, unless you really have a huge preference for, let's say, Kraft, right? Because I think it's, with Botman being out and then you've got Kraft and Shar, you're sort of dealing with that. Um, and so I think, yeah, that's probably the overarching point, that both Burn and Hall should have good minutes to start the season. But I wouldn't raise it to something like 90 minutes. I'd probably just I've run solves in the past with these players at 75, because I do think that they're 100%, and there's obviously like situations like, we've all seen it before. So, for example, if Trippier is playing, arguably we've never seen Trippier and Hall too much.
mm.
It always seems to be, going back to, let's say, something like Burn and Trippier, and that could just be because the roles are slightly different, or maybe the view on how good Trippier is as a defender is slightly different compared to, let's say, Livramento on a one-on-one basis, and that can have some implications on Hall minutes. So
Mm.
I think, yeah, it's not guaranteed that either player is 90 plus for me. So I have both at around 75, and that's how I've seen it.
That's a great point. So Trippier's transfer is still in limbo, right? Last we
Yeah, it's
know.
still not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then assuming that there's some possibility that he still stays, we also then have
Yeah.
to account for Livramento not playing at right back and therefore competing with both Hall and Burn at left back. So Livramento, I think no one is really considering him, even though I've seen him in some drafts. I don't think he's really a consideration. More of
Not for me.
a case of exactly more of a case of you want to go for a Dan Burn who has multiple positions open for him, because the point you mentioned about Trippier is that they basically switched to three at the back whenever Trippier was playing, and he used to bomb forward because they didn't want to give him any defensive responsibilities. So that absolutely makes sense that if they were to pursue with a similar setup, they would still prefer Dan Burn at left back, and maybe Lloyd Kelly can do the same role, but right now, because Cher is injured and Botman is injured as well, they do have limited options to start the season. So one to look out for, I guess, in terms of what transfers take place at Newcastle and how their defense changes over the next couple of weeks. But I would firmly avoid to start the season with, and once the transfer window is done, maybe we can then revisit this topic from a more firmer minutes reading perspective.
You'd avoid those players,
Whom?
or avoid anyone else? You'd avoid Livramento, right? Sorry.
Yeah,
Is that?
Livramento,
Yeah.
Kelly, and Gehi, because people were expecting him to
Yeah.
go to
Yeah.
Newcastle. People already had him in their team, so that's why I had to mention him as well. The next
No,
one
that's
is the next one is Villa fullbacks. So we know that Matson has gone to Villa, and we also know that Dinia's deal has it been done, because I saw that it was it was almost done, but I didn't see a firm transfer news on that front.
No.
Okay, yeah. So we still, on paper, have Moreno, Digne, and Matson competing for the left back spot. And for the right back spot, we have Konza and Cash. And do they have anyone else who can play there potentially?
I think the rumor is that they're going to sign Gertruda. I
Oh,
probably need to find out how to. I think it's
yeah.
Gertruda. I'm not sure if that's how you that might be how you pronounce it, but I think I have to say for both fullbacks, my issue is that Emery has been an absolute terrorist. So
Yes.
even when we thought that Moreno was very clearly preferred to Dean, you'd see something like 59-minute substitutions, maybe a benching 1 in 4 games,
Hmm.
and it doesn't take too much really for the fullbacks to lose minutes, at least based on my recollection. I've looked at the FBF page multiple times, just to remind myself of how it works with Emery, but yeah, I'd be concerned because for Maatsen, it's not like he's suddenly going to be thrown in there and be 90 minutes a game, which is really realistically what you want. Because even though
Hmm.
he's such an active player, it's not like Aston Villa are a good defense. So yes, yeah, it kind of suits the narrative of what we spoke to with someone like Robertson, where you need
Hmm.
that player actually playing more minutes. So I think that's the main concern, and I really wouldn't touch Maatsen at all. I mean, I don't think his EV is even strong enough, really, based on like 75 minutes a game, which for me already is actually quite aggressive. Because yeah, I really think that you'll see an as long as Dean is at the club and even has Moreno even left. I mean,
I
that's
don't
another
think
thing.
so. I don't think so.
So yeah, that's my main concern. And yes, of course, he could play minutes at the wing spot, but it's not a situation like Aït-Nouri where he's either probably playing 90 minutes and it's a mixture of attacking positions and the fullback position, or an early substitution at 75 minutes. It's really Maatsen can be benched at 59. He could be benched a game or two, and that's just the reality of the depth that they have at the club. And I think it still applies to the right back position, even if they sign Jota, because he'll probably need to be integrated and things like that. And they do have cash, and they do have Nedeljkovic as well.
Yeah, and also Konza, I just had to mention
Yeah,
because we
exactly.
know that
Point.
Konza is nailed. He will definitely play at centre back or right back wherever they choose to play him.
Yeah,
So that
I think
is,
right now
yeah,
they don't have any center back depth, right?
yes, they
Because
don't.
if Diego
Yeah,
Carlos is gone,
yeah.
Mings is still recovering.
They
Then
have
yeah, I
Pau
guess you're
Torres and Konza. That's it.
kind of stuck with those two for a while.
Absolutely. And even though we both are a little skeptical on Pau Torres and were happy that he wasn't selected for Euro 2024, it's good enough for the games that we intend to play Konza. So that'll do
Yeah,
for now. The next one is for Brentford. We have 2 players selected. We just wanted to touch on. One is Fabio Carvalho, who transferred from Liverpool to Brentford, and the other player is Ivan Toney, whose move to Saudi Pro League is maybe happening. I don't even know if that's the case because the new striker
yeah.
that Brentford signed, Thiago, is injured for I don't know how long. Honestly, it seems a pretty bad injury. Seems like a pretty bad injury. So, what are your thoughts on maybe looking at Tony later down the line? Because I've seen reviews, Solves recommending
Oh, it's
getting
amazing.
Tony after, let's say, I think Game Week 4 or Game Week 5 it was. So uh, and by Gaming 5, we already would know what is the reality because he would either be transferred to the Saudi Pro
Yeah,
League or he would start at Brentford every single game. So
yeah.
it's more about Carvalho, right? So let's start with Carvalho. What do you think his minutes will be to start the season?
Tough one. I I have to say I don't have a good enough understanding of Brentford to even take a guess. My very, very layman understanding of things is we've seen a somewhat big signing in the past with someone like Damsgaard, and it's
Hmm.
not like he ever became integrated into the main team. I think Carvalho is a better player than Damsgaard, probably. But you can maybe argue that Brentford actually haven't done great business when it comes to signing players. Obviously, things like Mbuma will go against what I've just said, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think I would completely see Carvalho as a player where I have to wait and see for the minutes to even be able to understand them, because we've also seen Brentford be, first of all, quite tactically adaptable.
Hmm.
And I also don't know how many roles Carvalho can realistically play, because I think we tend to just look at him as a left winger. So it'll be interesting to see how he gets integrated into the team. But I would completely look at it as a wait and see, even though he's had some actually really good minutes for Liverpool, so he's technically match fit. But I wouldn't take the punt on going him, in Game Week 1, and I wouldn't even dare to guess his xMins compared to some other players that I would be a bit more comfortable with.
That's a great answer, by the way, because I also do not have any read on how his xMins pan out to be. I guess my question should have been phrased differently, where would you look into, or would you consider him as an FPL asset later down the line when we know a formation where he's comfortable playing in and if his minutes look good enough? But I suppose that's also a question where you don't have enough data to trust any of his previous underlyings. And so it's also again a question of faith and what you see in the game weeks leading up to you considering him as an FPL asset, I suppose. So it's very uncertain. As you can see, both Fran and I are really struggling to gauge what sort of expected value we see him having. So want to wait and watch definitely. The final one is for Tottenham Hotspur, and of course, Dominic Solanke is the major news that has happened, the Solanke to Spurs. And then the other impact of that is Brennan Johnson's xMins, because I was seriously considering someone like Brennan Johnson as the 6.5 million midfielder in my team. But as soon as the Solanke transfer happened, I moved him out of my team. So I suppose the question is, we've seen Solanke's goal projections from a markets perspective, from a review perspective. So, what sort of impact do you foresee on Brennan Johnson in terms of a better attack for Spurs, overall better attack for Spurs, and secondly, his own expense because he is now competing with at least Kulusevski, because Richarlison has never played right wing, but I don't know. Angie's post press conference makes it seem like Richarlison is going nowhere. So, if that's the case, then how do we gauge his expense at right wing?
I think I might even start by saying that I don't think his EV is as good as we think. Because when you look at the underlying data, you have to say that this player is absolutely incredible. But it just seems like the EV isn't particularly good for a player who I wouldn't go further than 75 xMins for right now.
Yeah.
And part of that in my thinking is also just speaking to someone like Ange. Sorry, FPL critic actually, not Ange. I don't speak to Ange. Yeah, he's just been asking me for FPL advice on the side, but I'll give him any. But no, like speaking to someone from Critic who's quite well informed, it seems like the general consensus is that Tottenham would like to sign another winger, and potentially it's just someone who could supplement Son's minutes as opposed to Brennan Johnson's minutes. And I think the big pro for Brennan Johnson is that he can always play left wing if he's called upon. But I think this season we're clearly seeing that it's a left wing season for Son, and I still don't think Son early subs are going to happen too much, right? Yes, we've seen 80+ minute subs, but that's very few for, let's say, Brennan Johnson to share. And does he have, I guess, prio in that sense? I don't see it. So yeah, I'm a little bit low on Brennan Johnson, and part of that maybe is because we have some really great 5.5 mids in the game who arguably give you or provide you a lot more value, even over the opening run of fixtures. And I have to point out players like Smith Rowe or even Ben Berta Diaz or even Minte.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I suppose Solanke's impact is a little unknown, but also his own XG and his own sample size is huge. It's over 290s. So there is no doubt that he's going to improve that attack. And as Elevenify pointed out to us in the previous podcast, he foresees a better defense for Spurs, which on the face of it seems a little counterintuitive, but I guess that's why he runs elevenify.com and I don't. So we'll wait and see how that one pans out. The last one, I just wrote this down because I remembered. This is an interesting point. For Bournemouth, now that Solanke has left, we have Semenyo, Enes Unal when he's fit, and Kluivert. Now Kluivert took the previous penalty that they got, right? If I'm yeah. So because that's the case, I'm going to let Fran discuss this in further details. But I just wanted to point out these three players are now of interest to us. Yeah. Assuming Nketiah doesn't happen, by the way, because the Nketiah to Arsenal is on the to Bournemouth is on the cards.
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah. Interesting, because the Marseille deal has been closed. Yeah.
Oh, it has.
I think, as in, sorry, it's been shut down.
Okay.
But I think I'll even add Sinisterra to the mix because arguably you've got 4 spots, and then you have a couple backups. But I think with Solanke gone, what's nice is it gives a chance for some of the previous attackers to maybe get more experience in the center forward position whilst Enes Unal is out. But that really should only influence someone like Semenyo, because I do think that the CF share is believable. But then the question I go back to is, do they actually have right wing depth to even allow for Semenyo to move into the center forward position? That's my concern. So I think even though it feels like fake CF share because I feel like he has to play right wing. You have Sinisterra playing left wing, and then you probably have Kluivert playing as the 10 to start the season. But then someone like Alex, who's already in the club, he's going to take away some of those minutes too, and he can even start games as we've seen in the past. With Enes Unal, he's out for a few weeks, but he'll come back and he probably will take pen. So I think if you're investing into someone like Kluivert for penalties, that would be my concern. Because there's also an international break sandwiched in there. Now, a lot of the Bournemouth players are actually fantastic for game weeks 1 to 3. So if you wanted to go for any of them, I actually don't really mind it if you're going for a punt that just basically works out to be, let's say, a game week 4 wild card, sort of adjacent. And so I quite like Semenyo, but I will have to say that his review share, pen share is definitely quite juiced because Kluivert minutes seem decent to start. And so do you see Semenyo taking a pen? Probably not. So you have to take away a little bit of that EV there. Do I see that many center forward minute share for him? Possibly also not. So I think all of these players have good fixtures to start. So once again, good for wildcard 4. I'd probably try Semenyo's minutes the most. People will probably find Kluivert and Sinisterra a little bit more interesting just based on things like XG for someone like Sinisterra, and then for Kluivert, obviously pen share. That's great. But yeah, I'm probably leading Semenyo for like 80, 81 xMins a game. The other players probably in the low 70s. That's sort of my general thought. And that's probably enough to make me swerve most of them, sadly.
And let's assume the case where they do sign Nketiah. Does that make Nketiah the runaway cheap forward? Because he would probably also be on penalties. I think it's 5.5, but I have to check that.
Has Nketiah ever taken a penalty in his life?
Probably. That's also a good question. But I'm assuming that he's going to be the main man.
That live.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, I think people tend to really think main man takes penalties, but then I also think, God, if you have no history whatsoever, he doesn't have a penalty taking history.
Yeah, then
outside of shootouts. So
that muddies the water a little bit. I agree with you.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
But he's obviously a super high XG player, Nketiah, so he'll be interesting. Although I probably can't stand him for what he's done to my boy Kai Havertz in the past. So no, I'm kidding. But no, I think I'll have to consider Nketiah because I think Enes Unal is also someone who's very capable, right?
Yes.
I don't think Nketiah is really at the level of Solanke. Maybe that's wrong, but I'd imagine that his minutes will also be quite poor if Enes Unal can take a lot of the minutes.
Fair enough. I think for Semenyo as well, I suppose the way to counteract the 20% pen share, I believe it was, is to just reduce his minutes. And that is one way you can circumvent the pen share. Because as you said, I don't see him taking a penalty. So I would actually have him at close to 0% because I just don't want to buy him on the basis of that expected value and then never have it materialize. So that would be my estimate of his minutes.
I'm still waiting for Chris Wood to take a penalty over Morgan his way, and then we'll just have a legendary podcast episode or segment. So still waiting.
I drafted Chris Wood in all of my draft leagues yesterday, so I am waiting for that to happen for sure.
Right.
Yeah,
so you create your own EV draft.
Nice. Absolutely. So the final segment, as usual, for our podcast is captaincy. So for Game Week 1 captaincy, we have a lot of options. I'm just going to run through them. So for review, and these are sorted in descending order by expected value with default xMins. So bring your own xMins to the table first of all. But assuming for these players the minutes are good enough, so we have Salah, Isaac, Saka, Bruno Fernandes, Holland, and Son as the top 6 options. So I know that the two of us have the split captaincy between the second and the third best option. So what are the minutes or is slight uncertainty for Saka pushing you towards Isaac?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been leaning Isaac because I just see him as a 90-minute player, and he's fit in the preseason, whereas Saka, if he's ever going to play poor minutes in one game before the Champions League starts, it's this one, right? He just
Yes.
might be an early sub when they're leading, and they probably will be leading versus Wolves. Those are just my thoughts on Saka, but that's it.
And we did not discuss this in the minutes, the xMins corner, but I suppose the question with Salah is a lot of people have been asking if he's going to stay at Liverpool, which I, it baffles
Hmm.
me that question, but also maybe there is some truth to that because the transfer window is still open and we don't know what's going to happen. But do you see him not playing at Liverpool on, let's say, by September the 2nd?
Yeah, it's a weird one, right? Because I think always with some of these players, you have to think they must be thinking internally, do I accept a Saudi deal now when I can still compete for
Hmm.
things? And they're in the Champions League this season, so I'm just gonna say intuitively it's close to zero.
Yes.
But sure, I can say it's non-zero because you can look
Hmm.
at the Vinicius sort of numbers that are being floated about for his sort of Saudi package deal, and obviously they're ludicrous. So I wouldn't begrudge a player for doing it, and I wouldn't get upset if a player suddenly took a $1 billion deal. So yeah, I think look for Salah's case, I don't see it happening, but who knows? It very well could. I just don't think it's enough for me to. It probably wouldn't be the what I would rest on to choose
Hmm.
between, let's say, Haaland and Salah, or
Yeah.
to take Salah off of a Haaland plus Salah draft. I will say that. Um, yeah, that's all.
That is exactly what I was coming to. So this is not an excuse for me or for us to say that this is why we are not owning Salah because we are both massive fans of Mo Salah as an FPL player.
Yeah,
Even though last season he definitely
and he's
muddied
better than
us.
Hazard, right?
Yeah, yes, he is. There is no doubt about
Yes,
that. I will fight anyone who says otherwise, including stats then. So that's
right. Yeah, time and
yeah,
place. Yeah.
absolutely. And are you guys going to have a spaces this week?
I don't think. I'm not sure. We'll probably have to ask the account manager critic.
Yeah, okay.
Um,
Okay. So if they do, I will definitely be there. Spamming Salah is better than Hazard. Even though you can't technically spam it, yeah, I suppose.
right.
Um, I'll be there. So I guess that's that from what we had to discuss. Do you want to quickly go through the chat to see if we have any questions?
Yeah, sure. I think at the start, look, there's a lot of Oscar Bobb talk, so I think maybe we can just talk about the impacts in terms of the minutes around Oscar Bobb. So that probably gives Savinho a start potentially in Game Week 1. But then I also have to think, okay, why not just play Grealish and Doku potentially? It has been trialed before,
Hmm.
so I don't know if that will actually happen. Or you can just go back to Bernardo Silva, right?
Yes.
Realistically, Silva's there. KDB played 5 minutes, so he could maybe at least start the game and then come off for someone like Foden.
Hmm.
I think that's very realistic. So I'm not immediately, jumping on the Savinho hype train is probably what I would say. It's not great, clearly. We've seen Cancelo right wing before. I've seen it in the chat as well. I don't think we're going to see it again. Just to touch on that. Um, but look, it's going to be good for someone like Grealish if we find out that he's actually fully fit to start Game Week 1. Because I tentatively think that's nice, but it's still not good enough because yeah, you're still dealing with potentially three players for two spots,
Hmm.
even with Bob being out. And yeah, I don't think it's good enough for me.
Yeah, and I suppose you
Look
don't
what's
even
wrong.
have to be precise about it, right? In this case, because
Yeah,
there's so many players who have played right wing and so many players who can play right wing that it's just there's no reason for you to even consider those positions, right? We can just I mean, Foden would have been a good player because he has excellent underlines, but he's not a consideration for Game Week 1 anyway. So it doesn't
yeah.
matter. You have to go Holland and a City defender, or it's just going to be Holland for Game Week 1, I suppose. Uh, One of the questions we had in the chat, I'm just going to go through some of these and see where we go with that. Barmy Army has a question. He says Jota and Poro or Bruno and Kwanzaa.
Sorry, Jota and Porro or Bruno Kwanzaa. I'd
Yeah,
probably go tough one because I think you've got.
yeah, it's like
I'd probably go Bruno. I'd
yeah,
probably go
same,
Bruno and
same,
Kwanzaa, but
same.
yeah,
Absolutely. You're right. It is not as straightforward as it seems because both sides have one player who has slightly dicey mints, I suppose, but It's how the mints are distributed. That
Yeah.
helps.
Next question. I think so. Bob just generally had a point about whether my team was the FPL review team.
Yeah, I'm just going to say one thing. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you.
Yeah, go for it.
There is no the review team, and I guess we are
Mm.
tired of telling this again and again, but it's just, it's fact. There is no such thing as the review team. There's a review literally has like 1,000 settings now, and it's impossible to replicate teams. It's just that for certain strategies, people will converge onto similar teams. And believe me, I think based on the next couple of days, Fran and I might actually diverge even more because with Eze, I'm right on the fence, but I think Fran has
Right.
convinced me because I was also thinking about Kamada or Sar, but Fran has actually talked me out of those players because I was honestly thinking, if I do Eze to someone like Kamada and then spend the money somewhere else.
I
And
think just go Smith Rowe at that point.
fair enough, that's a great point. So that's what I'm saying, that this is just there's no the review team, and we're just trying to get as much EV as we can within the reason.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think also maybe Bob might not be someone who's used review before, so
yeah,
just generically said that reviews an algorithm. I mean, yes, it's a model, just like we have multiple models, like Fantasy Football Hub have a model. I think Scouts still have a model. I'm sure
yeah.
Mikel Okfam has a model as well. Um, these things have expected value. You can create a team around it, but like Shannon Ford said, we are planning Wildcard 6, and a lot of the teams could be quite similar. So we are 13 out of 15 right now, but it's not like your team's the review team or my team's the review team. A
Mm.
lot of what comes out as your team will be based out of specific things that you adjust. So xMins parameters on the solver or whatever solver you use. You could even be using your own solver on Excel or Python or Colab or whatever. But the point is, all these things are also a point in time as well in terms of the EVs,
Yep.
and how you also even foresee how you plan your team is also very different. You don't have to copy a solve from review. I can tell you that my top solve probably had Muniz in it instead of João Pedro and Rogers.
Yep.
And the fact that I'm on a João Pedro and Rogers team is simply because I value Rogers being someone who can actually add a bit of depth to my team,
Mm.
whilst also covering a bad João Pedro game. And I'm also leaving room for the fact that João Pedro's minutes can be better than I expect, which is why I'm on João Pedro. But yeah, the point is, a lot of us use models in the space. It gives us an understanding of maybe an objective view of what picks are good or what picks are bad. But whenever I think we as managers want to swerve it or potentially have a good reason to swerve it, I think we will do, and we will naturally swerve versus other players who also use review because we're on different paths. So if you're planning wildcard 4, if I'm planning wildcard 6, we're going to have a different team, and none of them are going to be the review team. And if you just ran a quick solve and review right now, I'd encourage you to let me know if my team's the review team. That's what I'd probably say to Bob.
Great
Couple
point.
questions on that, but we'll skip through.
Carlos has a question, I think. He says, would you
Great.
prefer Solanke and Saka or Son and Havertz?
I think I'd prefer Solanke and Saka, and my answer will be that I think Saka is actually quite crucial in a lot of drafts because he's the Game Week 3 dominant captain. And unless you think that Son is a better captain than him, which I think is totally fair, you could see it. Because another issue with Son right now in review is that he has less pen share than he previously did. So because Solanke has been added into the game, and the way he's modeled in review right now is that he's got 40% pen share, maybe my answer is that the EV golf is not going to be exactly as it is in review, as per our understanding. But as far as I understand, even before the Solanke transfer, we know Son is going to probably play left wing. We know that he's going to have great pen share, but the EV is still not that close. So I would still be pretty high on Saka for that perspective. And then I guess the question is also Solanke versus Havertz. I don't think there's too much to split the two. I do actually tentatively have to say that I prefer Havertz. And my issue, I guess, is that when you're asking with a pair, technically you can go Saka and Havertz, right? I imagine. So then
Yeah.
I think the question is about Saka versus Son first, and then Solanke versus Havertz, because you don't necessarily need to have coverage of both teams. You can
Yes.
actually just have two picks from Arsenal, which my answer would actually be go Saka and Havertz, because I think they're both the better player in both instances.
Yeah, I think that is the right answer, or the the better pairing in this situation, because you are not limited by having to have one player from each team. So makes
I mean, it's a
sense.
good point actually, because a lot of people do talk about the concept of coverage, right? So do you want to
Yes.
maybe just tackle it? Because I think Trout in the past has also published an article about even going back to defenses, for example.
Hmm.
People don't like doubling up on a defense unless it's, let's say, Arsenal defense, right?
Hmm.
But I think he posted a study about how you'd always prefer, let's say, two players with 10% extra clean sheet share than, let's say, spreading the defense and sort of going for 145% and 155%, if that makes sense. So yeah, I mean, my answer would be that very much still applies to the offense, although you can probably also retort that, I guess, the goals have to be shared by those specific
Hmm.
players. But look, that's why we have EV for a reason. And yeah, I just think that the game is, as Elevenify has always said, whenever he comes on as a guest, which also covers another comment in the chat, but he's always said, this game is about maximizing points. So if maximizing points means that you might be actually doubling up on a player because their expected value or expected points, I suppose, are higher, then you should always go with that unless there's a really negligible difference in the expected value, which makes you want to actually diversify between two attackers or two defenders. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that.
No, very quickly, because you've already said most of what I was thinking. Uh, with the doubling up on the defense, I think defense is more so.
Mhm.
So Trout's article was more about defense. I still think that
Yes.
for attack, you could probably try to see if coverage works, but then you will have to have players who have similar underlying stats. That is, I
Yeah.
think, the key. And in this
Mm.
case, it's not real. Maybe it is the case, but it's not really the case because of pen share. Because I just feel
Yeah.
like pen share certainty with Saka is much more than pen share certainty with Son. Even though, like you, I believe that Solanke's pen share is too high. I still foresee Son
Good
taking
point,
most of
right?
the penalties.
Yeah. No, you actually make a great point because it kind of reminded me of when I free hit last season. I went for Wood and Morgan as good white because I still innately thought that Chris Wood could have pen share. So
Yep.
getting both gives you pen share, but then yeah, I guess I suppose do you want Arsenal's pen share or Spurs' pen share? I'd probably want Arsenal's.
It
Uh,
caps you at 100%, right? Rather than
yeah,
you having pen share from, let's say, more than 100% because you have both the
yeah,
main penalty takers. So we can move
fair.
on to. So Luis Bonilla says, "Hello, Fran and Schadenfreude is from the US." Yeah, hi, Luis. Um, do we have any other questions? I don't think you. Oh,
I
okay.
mean, there's a little bit of discussion about Man City being a weaker squad than last season. Maybe you want to touch on that.
So
The
someone in
very
the chat
weak-
has already written that this is what people say every single season based on
Yes.
how their transfers pan out. I definitely don't think they are. I feel like
Yeah.
the gap between them and their nearest, um, how do I say, pursuiter,
Cool.
is that, if that is a
Yeah.
word,
Okay.
because they don't really have a rival per se, but whoever is in pursuit, the closest
Right. Fair
team,
enough.
um, is Arsenal, and they definitely are closer than probably anyone has been before. Maybe Liverpool, the
Yeah.
season they won the league, obviously, is the one exception. And the
Mm.
season where they lost by 1 point, I suppose that team is pretty close to that. But not really. I don't think so because Alvarez leaving City was inevitable, right? We already spoke about it. The moment he went to the Olympics was sort of like the final nail in the coffin where he was signaling to the team that he does not want to play for City anymore, indirectly.
Yes.
Maybe I am making it
No,
seem a
I
little
think
more
that's
dramatic.
actually a great point, and we
Yeah,
didn't really capture that because he played two international tournaments back to back just to avoid
yeah.
playing football for Man City. And that's genius. No, I'm kidding, but I think actually a good point even to raise is just that yes, whilst Arsenal have actually improved, it didn't actually mean that City got worse. I
Yes.
think Arsenal just got a lot better, and
Yeah.
particularly so in defense. And so when you look at, and I think this is a great time to plug Elevenify's first pod with Simon. So have a look at and have a listen to the team discussion and strengths there. And it forms a little bit of a Premier League preview and also touches on a team like Man City and how they're still actually projected to be the best team in the league by some distance in conjunction with Arsenal. So I think clear separation from those two teams in the rest of the field. But City haven't necessarily gotten any worse, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. So George says Thomas Frank said Tony will be a Brentford player this season. So if that is true, then because
Mm,
also something to point out that press conferences have been happening prior to a streaming and
yeah.
will be happening after a stream. So make sure you are tuned into those because we might not cover stuff that for players or teams that are yet to have press conferences. So Lars Thorin says, "Do you have an opinion on Bench Boost 1? In theory, it seems like maybe the best week." The simple answer
Uh,
is I don't, because at most it is going to be one of the better weeks. Okay, let me rephrase. I believe that even if there were no big double game weeks, there is definitely going to be another game week after game week 1, which is going to be
yeah.
equally as good as game week 1 to bench boost. So I feel
Hmm.
like the risk is too high, and I've already paid my dues, and I don't see myself doing it again. And it's not even about my bench boost going badly. It's just I don't see the value.
Right. I really also would answer that the issue with bench boost one is it also probably necessitates a wild card two,
Hmm.
or a very early wild card, and that
Hmm.
might not necessarily set you up perfectly. Because one of my issues is, okay, we're saying this season that it's actually really advantageous to get to 3 to 4 transfers, right? Free transfers, that is. If you're actually going to press the bench boost one button, you're forcing the early wild card, and you might actually also be forcing early transfers too,
Hmm.
especially if you're going to do wildcard too. So you no longer have the insurance, or you no longer have the opportunity to use the wildcard as an insurance blanket, which I don't love.
Hmm.
When we have the opportunity to do so this season. And another point, yeah, is just if you don't think unless you actually really think wildcard two is the best sort of window
Hmm.
to plug the wildcard, we've already been talking about a couple issues, right? Eze, Tony, a couple other players where definitely I think if you actually had the advantage of having a wild card saved, you can actually make some pretty wise moves with that. So already from that, I'd like to keep the wild card. But another thing too is Bob and Ahmad very well could not start game week 1, and I think they were actually part, or honestly a huge part of why you'd want to bench
Yep.
boost one in the first place, because you'd
Yep.
have two players who are incredible at 5.0 each, playing for great teams in a home fixture, or still at least a really decent away fixture for a top team in the league. So because those two options are probably closed, although we might get an Ahmad League. I don't think we get United Leagues though, if I recall,
So
in
we
FPL.
do, but the thing is, most of them are not great sources. So
Mm.
you're right.
Okay.
Ultimately, it does mean that we don't have reliable leaks there.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think with those two options gone, that probably also limits the ceiling of your bench boost. So I actually already think that bench boost one is not great. What's nice though is you have some great Brentford fixtures, to be honest. Like a lot of Brentford options are cheap, really good value. Uh, but yeah, I think you have to deal with the opportunity cost as well of what happens later in the season when you're planning for double game weeks and you just naturally have a good team
Hmm.
anyways because you've been
You've
planning
planned.
for the
Yeah.
doubles.
Yeah.
Because usually what happens with the doubles is it's not necessarily that you're planning for a bench boost. It's actually the fact that you're planning for the doubles that creates a really deep team. So it's not necessarily that we're always planning for a bench boost. We might force an extra -4. We might force an additional transfer, an additional sort of player on the wild card later into the season because of a bench boost. But it's more so the double game week that really changes our team, and the blank game weeks, and we'll still have some of them. I think Ben actually mentioned that there's more double game weeks to be expected than we thought initially, based on the sort of initial sort of announcement of the news last season, or the tail end of last season. So I think we'll also have larger team value then,
Hmm.
and hopefully we'll create a more well-rounded bench boost as well. That is a bit more natural too. I think that's key.
Makes total sense. So there's a couple of questions left, but I'm just going to point out a couple of things. So firstly, join our mini league if you haven't. The code is right up here somewhere. I'm pointing incorrectly because I'm mirrored.
Yeah,
So
top right corner
top
of the
right
actual
corner,
YouTube
it's
screen. So
AVVYXP for podcast listeners. So Fran explained where it is, and then he also pointed to the wrong spot. So that's great. And also a shout out to the first member of our channel, Marvin Tyres. You're a legend, and
yeah,
we've
legend.
already posted about him on YouTube. So the last couple of questions are. Thoughts on Delict and Mazraoui as new options in United's defense? Mazraoui is 4.5, which is a nice price point. Don't go for
I'm just
United
stuck on United
defense.
Defence.
Yeah, don't go for United defense. Although, of course, these are
Until you sign a midfielder?
excellent upgrades, but
Yeah.
yeah, the midfield is still. I mean, the fact that Bruno still has to keep playing this weird role where he has to be the creator and the ball recoverer and everything else in between. I just don't understand where we are going with that. I guess the Ugarte loan deal is still on. If we sign Ugarte, I will be much happier with punting on someone like Delict or Mazraoui. So if assuming that Mazraoui and Delict are fit and ready to start game week 1, I would assume that the back four is Mazraoui right back, Delict centre back, Lisandro Martinez centre back, and then left back would be Dallo for game week 1.
I forgot about the Shaw injury again. I mean, how
Yes,
ridiculous is that
it
news?
is absolutely. And I told you, there is no use of even thinking about him. And I
Right.
think akin to
I get it.
Alvarez, he has made his choice, which I respect because
Fair.
people
Because it is country. Yeah.
absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind I would do something similar in his position. So I respect that, but at the same time, I have to give up on him as an FPL asset because
Yeah.
it's a shame, right? He was a top FPL asset in his heyday, or I suppose his heyday was very short lived, which seems to be the
Yeah.
center point. But coming back to the point, don't go for United defense to start with. We need to see how they play together, and this English version of Ajax FC needs some time to to settle down because it's exactly what it is now. It's Ajax FC now.
Yeah. Also shout out Shy and a couple other people in chat for being here.
Absolutely.
I think my Lotaf says another great stream, guys. Who's absolutely locked into your squads? That's a great question, actually, and we can probably end off here.
Yes.
Do you want to just go one by one? You go first.
Bruno Fernandes,
Trent,
Holland.
Isak.
Yeah. This is a good Poro.
I think I have to say Kwanzaa right now.
Oh wow, okay. Dean Henderson.
And I'll close off with João Pedro.
Let's go. I
Yeah.
was going to say Isri Konsa, but fair enough.
So we didn't mention Nkunku and Eze, and I think the reason is because we might be. Okay, actually, a good point. Just to close off the pod, Nkunku, right? Would you be worried about the transfer speculation? Like, let's say they're going for another 9, which I think is that's the news
Osimhen,
that
right?
Osimhen
Yeah.
and Lukaku is a swap deal.
Yeah.
Are you worried about Nkunku at that point, or is he a lock for you still?
I will be more worried about him. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I don't. I mean, it's ridiculous.
But just by a sliver, right? Because it's just you're just
Yes.
thinking, okay, does he hit the upper bounds of like the immense? But then I think also it goes back down to that question of like what we mentioned with Elevenify, where are we really missing out on a player who could potentially just be insane just because of a couple mins? Is always what I'm leaning back to, because when I look at like Rob T's like season-long goal projections, and shout out Rob TFPL on Twitter,
Yeah.
but when you look at that, there's nobody close to Nkunku, who's a 6.5 million attacker in FPL, bar João Pedro at 5.5, who's already in my team. And I'm just thinking, are we just reading a little bit too much into the fearmonger, I guess, around the minutes, or is there a genuine point of concern? Because I don't know if Enzo is really a terrorist per se. Like, is he going to be suddenly doing 4 subs at 65 minutes? Like, I don't really know. I don't think so. Certainly.
I think there's a lot of uncertainty with how he's going to set up, but I appreciate
that's
that
fair.
he might not be as much of a minutes terrorist as some of the other managers. It's just that there are so many options at Chelsea that it's unprecedented, right? In terms of me trying to assess a Premier League team for minutes, I don't know where to begin.
Because I guess the issue is that Osimhen's deal won't be closed by the transfer deadline.
Yes,
so let's say
yes.
gun to your head now is Nkunku in your team.
Yeah, I mean, gun to my head, I should have probably already answered, but
yeah,
no.
At this point, recording, you already died. So
yes, no. Right now, though. What about you?
No. Great. I'd say yes. Because I feel like you can always like I don't think there's any options above him in price point that I'm really worried about. Like, oh, am I swerving on a player that I suddenly think is amazing? I guess the option would be Jota, right? But no, in reality, I think if anything, if I get the pick wrong, I think I'll just be downgrading from him. So I'm not too worried, really. All things said.
Fair point. I had a gun to my head, so I had to answer quickly, I suppose, which I didn't. But
Right.
let's see.
Which you
Let's see what happens. So I think on that note, we will
right.
close off the pod. We really appreciate everyone that has joined today. We had a lot of concurrent viewers, so really appreciate everyone
Amazing.
who
Thank you guys so much.
absolutely. You all are legends, and we'll see you next week. Hopefully, you have a great start to the season, and we'll be here every week going through our teams, going through the whole shebang for xMins, captaincies, all of that. So
Yeah.
thank you guys for watching and see you next week. Bye.
Thank you.